Moving on down from the core to the muscles of the pelvic region. If you take anatomy and physiology in college, you'll talk more about gender specific muscles of this region, but the majority of the muscles in this region are common to both males and females, and those are the ones, just a few of those, are the ones we're going to look at today. Your formatting on this page might be off. When I did it in Word, it's in two columns. When it came up in Google Classroom, it came up as one long page. So I'm talking from the Word document. I'm sorry if the columns aren't right, but the information's still all there. When I look at this picture, the first thing I see is the muscle going from my backbone to my front of my femur, which is creepy. And then I see a whole network of muscles going from the medial pelvis to the leg. So there's a lot going on here with a lot of smaller muscles. So the tensor fascia lata, which whenever I say lata, I think of latte, like milk coffee. Tensor fascia lata is, in my copy, underneath where the legs are. That's on the outside of the hip. It lines the outside of the pelvis, and if you look, there's a band of tissue that connects it the whole way from the lateral hip at the pelvis down to the knee. This is called your iliotibial tract or iliotibial band, and its action is to abduct. Remember, we abduct and adduct. It abducts your thigh, which is to raise it to the outside. IT band syndrome is a big problem for runners because as you move, normally that iliotibial tract or band, that connective tissue, slides across the outside of your knee, no problem. But if you're running not quite right, or you're running more, or your shoes are crooked, or you're on rough terrain, you can tweak it a little bit and it'll start to swell, either at your hip or at your knee. Once it starts to swell, it doesn't slide over the epicondyle, that bump at the end of the femur. It doesn't slide over that well. It tends to get stuck just a little. So every time it rubs across, it swells a little, and every time it swells, it sticks a little more. So that if you keep using it, it's going to get worse and worse. People with IT band syndrome who try to run sort of have like a hop to that side because you don't think of lifting your leg outward as you run, and you don't really. But that muscle stabilizes your leg and is starting to get stuck when your knee moves. IT band syndrome is a nasty running injury. It goes away quickly, not really permanent damage from it. You can run with it. It's just going to hurt a lot longer, and usually you look pretty silly because you kind of hop. It's like a three-legged dog, kind of. It's ugly. It goes away well once the swelling goes down. Rest, ice, all that good stuff. Put an ice pack on the two corners where it's going to swell and all of that good stuff, but it is kind of yucky. These next two are pretty cool, even though it's gross. Actually, really quickly back to the picture, you'll notice the adductor, adductor, adductor gracilis on the inside. We're going to come back to the gracilis with the leg, I believe, and if not, if we don't get back to the gracilis, it's an adductor. It pulls the leg inward, as does the adductor longus, meaning the long one, the adductor brevis, meaning the short one. All those do is, if you can see where they attach, they go pelvis to leg, and they pull your leg inward. The tensor fascia lata is the antagonist to that, raising your leg outward. Psoas major and iliacus are pretty cool. These are your hip flexors. If you've heard anybody say anything about hip flexor, if you watch any sports, hip flexor strain, this is collectively your hip flexor, and its action is to flex your hip. Your psoas major creeps me out, because if you look at that picture, it goes lumbar vertebrae to proximal femur, and if you're going, okay, well, that's back to front. It has to go through your intestines to do that. It actually goes through your squishy guts, and it comes out the front. So that's funky. Sometimes with hip flexor pain, people will get low back pain because of the psoas major. The iliacus lines the inside of your pelvis, kind of like your rotator cuff lines your scapula, within your pelvis to your proximal femur, but they attach really close to the same place, right at the top of your hip, and they work together. Usually, unless you're having back pain with it, you'll be diagnosed with a hip flexor strain, or people will talk about this collective term, ilio-psoas. Combine the two names because they have such a common function. So that's pelvic region. Let's see what happens when I scroll down. Oh, there they are. I do have more muscles listed at the bottom, so I guess my formatting isn't perfect either. Gracilis attaches at that obturator foramen, biggest foramen in the body. It's on the inside, as is the adductor group, medial thigh. They pull the leg in, adduct. This is a review, abduction versus adduction as well. I put the piriformis in here because it's a weird little muscle. All of the muscles we just looked at run pretty much top to bottom and move you this way. They move you in, I guess, the sagittal plane. Piriformis is strange. It actually runs through your butt horizontally. You have two. They go obturator foramen to the outside of your femur. So they basically go across your butt. And if you think about tightening something going this way, it'll rotate your leg laterally. It rotates your leg this way. So piriformis is also a nasty thing in runners. I was reading a book about piriformis syndrome, and it said it's literally a pain in the butt. It is, because it hurts where the muscle is, so your butt is sore, your butt muscles are sore, but it also affects the way that your leg lands, because if the piriformis is tight, you don't always notice, but it rotates the toe on that side outward as it tightens. I've had some runners with this, and it's terrible. I tell them to go home, sit on the arm of the couch, and wiggle their bum. Put a cheek on the arm of the couch because you can get the knot out of the muscle that way. I said, don't do it when anybody's home. It's kind of weird. But the piriformis is a strange little muscle. It's tiny. It's not much bigger than a strap at one point, like the little tiny thin muscles we'd looked at in the arm. It's not big at the end, gets bigger, and it hurts a lot when it's not so good. So the piriformis, I'm not sure you can see it on that picture, maybe in the gluteal picture. It's under the gluteus maximus, so you don't see it so much in pictures. But if you go down to the next page, and no pun intended on but, when you look at muscles of the posterior thigh on the next page, you'll see the gluteus minimus and 3 muscles below it going outward to the femur, and I believe the middle one of those, almost directly horizontally, is the piriformis. And you'll see why, if it's overly tight, it'll rotate your leg outward with the origin at the obturator foramen and the insertion, the connection on the outer femur. All parts of your gluteal group, you'll see why maximus is maximus. It's by far the biggest part of those. And you'll see that the medius and minimus line the pelvis on the outside, much like the iliacus did on the inside. You might remember me saying, too, that the hamstring group was where you hung your pigs from. You strung your hams. But the picture I put in your packet is pretty nice to show you the 3 parts. If you look at that picture, you can see why the biceps femoris is the biceps femoris. There are 2 parts, so 2 heads, biceps and femoris in the leg, rather than biceps brachii in the arm. You've got 3 parts to your hamstrings. You're not really going to need to know those names, but I think a true-false question that there's a biceps in the leg and in the arm comes up somewhere. So there you go. Your gluteal group's in your bum. It's in your buttocks. 3 parts. This opposes your iliopsoas. Your iliopsoas flexes your hip, and your gluteal group extends. Hamstring posterior thigh, 3 parts. The action of your hamstrings group is to flex the knee. Kicking is extending the knee, and bending the knee is flexing. So, we talked about those when we did groups earlier. There you go. That's really all I had to say on those 2 because we'd looked at them briefly. Know the function, all of that good stuff. 3 parts to your hamstrings to go with the 4 parts of the quads we're going to look at next time. There you go.